Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome TPA Leadership Council member, Ellie Lopez.
Good evening and welcome to TPA Talks on the agenda, genetics and fertility. I'm Ellie Lopez and I'm proud to be a member of the Pink Agenda's Leadership Council and to serve on the Education Committee. Raising awareness about tonight's topic is especially important to me. The CDC estimates that 1 in 400 people have a BRCA gene mutation that increases risk of developing breast and other cancers. And I happen to be the one. With a lengthy family history, I was not surprised to receive my positive results for the BRCA1 mutation. I immediately started surveillance, which included alternating mammograms and breast MRIs every 6 months. I found out about my status before I started my family, so my path to eventually electing to undergo preventative double mastectomy and reconstruction actually took about a decade. And during this time, I had countless conversations with my care team, my family, friends, and other women with BRCA mutations who I was blessed to meet along the way about making the best decision for me, and none of it was easy. I believe that knowledge is power, and I joined the Pink Agenda this year to contribute to its mission to raising awareness of this disease among young professionals. There is so much I wish I had known before my surgery, and we created TPA Talks on the agenda to share personal experiences and what we've learned with others who are facing decisions about preventative care or about a breast cancer diagnosis in the hopes that we can help make their journeys a little bit easier. We are also fortunate to learn from researchers funded by TPA and our partner, the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, who are continually investigating new ways to prevent, treat, and cure this disease. These events would not be possible without the leadership of the Pink Agenda's Education Committee and the support of everyone watching tonight. It's only because of incredible progress in research that I was able to learn about my BRCA mutation, to participate in extensive surveillance care and elect to undergo a mastectomy, treatments that will ultimately give me more time with my family. However, this year's headline news that breast cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in the world, because of that news, it's clear that our work is not yet done. More alarmingly, within our community, there was a 32% increase of metastatic breast cancer diagnoses in women aged 25 to 39 between the years 2009 and 2015. The Pink Agenda approaches these major problems from 2 angles: through the research we fund and through educational programming designed to reach this population. Tonight, we ask you to join us in moving this work forward. At any time, you can take out your cell phone and text the phrase TPA Talks, no spaces, to the number 44321 to receive a secure link to donate. This phrase and phone number are also listed in the digital program booklet. We're so fortunate to have incredible panelists this evening and know that they will inspire you to be a part of game-changing progress. Thank you in advance. I'm looking forward to their conversation, which will be moderated by Amanda Rice. Amanda is a consultant in the financial industry by trade, and she is also the founder and CEO of the Chick Mission. The Chick Mission is on a mission to ensure that every young woman newly diagnosed with cancer has the option to preserve fertility through direct financial support, educational programs, and advocacy for legislative change. It's deeply personal work for Amanda, who was inspired to create the organization after her own experiences with cancer. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Amanda to kick off tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Ellie. And it is such an honor to be a part of this. I have been a fan of the Pink Agenda and BCRF and all of these researchers since I was first diagnosed in 2014. I am super excited to get started tonight. So we're really here tonight to talk about genetics and fertility in the face of breast cancer and beyond. With my personal experience navigating 3 cancer diagnoses before my 40th birthday, and really hearing the stories of all of the women that we've helped at the Chick Mission, really this hits home. I think there's a lot of access that we have helped women to get on the fertility front as an organization, but I know this conversation is incredibly important. So over the past decade, awareness of genetic mutations, specifically mutations to the BRCA gene that can increase one's risk of breast cancer and other cancers, has grown significantly. Though genetic mutations play a major role in only an estimated of 5 to 10% of all cancers, interest in genetic testing and preventative treatments for young adults, especially those whose mothers, aunts, grandmothers, who have had cancer, continues to rise. Simultaneously, the rise of social media has contributed to this increased awareness. Not only that women can be diagnosed with breast cancer in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, but also that having the disease at a younger age comes with unique hurdles and challenges. You're thrown a lot with a cancer diagnosis, and then to have to think about fertility, just makes it even more complex. So one particularly complex challenge can be having to make all of these difficult decisions, about fertility and future family planning on a very quick timeline. Those who are BRCA positive, or really any other genetic mutations, also often consider their status when making family plans, and the possibility that their children could inherit these mutations comes into play. For younger people who may be just starting out their careers or navigating new relationships, it's really crucial that they have access to this information and support, both medically and emotionally, so that they are empowered to make, these life-changing choices with confidence. And I think, both TPA and the Chick Mission have this in common. We really are trying to educate everyone about their options before, treatment takes those options away from you. So we are so fortunate to have a truly esteemed panel of experts with us tonight to discuss these deeply important topics from every angle, bringing the perspectives of the doctor, the researcher, the previvor, and the survivor, and also the advocates. So I'm going to start this evening. We had a little powwow, and the doctors would prefer we call them by their first name. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Susan Domchek, but I'm going to try my hardest as a patient, not of hers, to refer to her as Susan. So Dr. Domchek is a medical oncologist. She serves as the executive director of the Vassar Center for BRCA and the director of the McDonald Women's Cancer Risk Evaluation Center, both at Penn Medicine. A member of BCRF's Scientific Advisory Board, her research focuses on the genetic evaluation, medical management of those who have inherited risk factors for cancer. She is a significant contributor. I didn't know if I read this correctly, but she's authored or co-authored more than 350 articles appearing in scholarly journals and serving on a number of editorial review boards, including the Journal of Clinical Oncology. Dr. Domchek is also the Vassar Professor in Oncology at the Perelman School of Medicine, an elected member of many national medical societies. So welcome, Dr. Domchek. Susan.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here for this important conversation. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Next up is Dr. Ann Partridge. Dr. Partridge is a medical oncologist and clinical researcher, and she serves as the Vice Chair of Oncology and the Director of the Adult Survivorship Program at Dana-Farber Cancer Center in Boston. Her research, supported by the Pink Agenda through BCRF, focuses on treatment, survivorship, and psychosocial issues faced by young women with breast cancer. She founded and directs Dana-Farber's Young and Strong program, love that name, which has guided thousands of young women under the age of 40 through and beyond their diagnosis and treatments. Dr. Partridge is also a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and she serves on many national committees advising on cancer research and care. She has published numerous manuscripts and lectures and has received several grants and rewards recognizing her work in cancer survivorship. Hello, Dr. Partridge.
Hi, Amanda, and you can call me Ann, but you can also call me Dr. Partridge if that's more comfortable for you. Very happy to be here.
I'm going to try my best to call you Ann. And rounding out our incredible panel is Erica Stallings. Erica is an attorney by trade and currently serves as the Associate General Counsel at Facebook, advising product teams on the use of licensed music and other intellectual property. She is also a talented writer and staunch patient advocate. And she began this work when she learned she carries the BRCA2 mutation and chose to undergo preventative mastectomy in 2014. Her writing shares her experiences through BRCA positive and discusses racial disparities in healthcare. And she's been published in the New York Times, The Cut, and O Magazine, among many others. Erica is the founding co-chair of the Young Leadership Council at the Vassar Center for BRCA and a partner of the center's Black and BRCA Awareness Initiative. She also serves as a patient advisor on a research study at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which aims to increase genetic counseling and testing amongst minority patients. It's great to see you, Erica.
I am so excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you all for being with us tonight. I know it's going to be a fantastic conversation and everybody's going to get a whole lot out of it. So let's start with the basics. Susan, can you tell us more about the BRCA gene? What is it exactly and how does it affect somebody's risk for cancer? And what are other genetic mutations that affect someone's risk of cancer?
Sure. So the genes that people know most about are BRCA1 and BRCA2. They stand for breast cancer 1 and breast cancer 2 because scientists aren't really that creative in the end of the day. And they were just the first genes that were identified to be associated with a risk of cancer. And everyone has BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. They actually help, they're helpful to the cells. They help repair DNA damage. It's when you are born with a bad copy or a mutation or a pathogenic variant. We keep changing the names just to make us look smarter, but they're all the same. A mutation is what's most commonly called. If you're born with a mutation, that significantly increases your risk of developing breast cancer in the range of 70%, the risk of ovarian cancer up to 45%. And there's other risks, particularly for BRCA2, for things like prostate and pancreatic cancer. But those, as you mentioned, are not the only genes. They're just the ones that people know the most about and have been studied the longest. The thing that's closest to BRCA3, if you will, is a gene called PALB2. There are other genes, but the risks are very different in mutations in these other genes. So CHEK2 and ATM are pretty common, but the risks of breast cancer are not nearly as high as for BRCA1 and 2, with lifetime risks more than like 25%. And importantly, as we'll, I'm sure, talk about, even though these types of genetic mutations are more common in young women, those under 40, most women who are under 40 who have cancer, breast cancer, do not have these gene mutations. So we haven't figured everything out yet. We still are interested in genetics, but we also have to realize that there's combinations between genetic and environmental factors that we haven't sorted out yet.
Fascinating. Well, I really think, on a personal note, I was diagnosed for the first time in 2014, and they did some genetic testing then. And then when I was diagnosed for the third time in 2017, they did another panel of genetic tests. And the amount, I'm sure because of your great work, the number of mutations that they were checking for just in a 3-year period had grown immensely. So, my hat's off to you guys. And I'm sure today in 2021, there are a lot more. So we're gonna solve this puzzle with your great work. And we know how challenging a breast cancer diagnosis is for anybody, but for young women, there's a whole host of added complications, including how treatment can impact their fertility. So Dr. Partridge, and when's the best time to start talking to patients about how and when they can get pregnant? And how do these recommendations differ for those with a genetic mutation?
So that question is something I try to make sure that all the clinicians, doctors, nurses who touch a young patient on their breast cancer journey know to address it as early as possible. And the reason for that, particularly when patients are sent, maybe not in the mammography suite or in the ultrasound suite, because sometimes you're not even sure it's cancer in that setting. But once you know someone has a breast cancer, it's really important that we think about this early on in the diagnostic period, so that if a woman is at risk for infertility from treatments, she may be able to get the information she needs to inform whether or not it makes sense for her to preserve her fertility. And there's a number of different strategies to approach. So the short answer to that question is early and often. And the often part is also when a person's really kind of, early diagnosed right away. And obviously you guys have experience and can share that with us. Sometimes it's a little too much to handle right at the beginning to even think about it, let alone make these important decisions. But it's something that we need to go back to. So not only right at diagnosis, but maybe the second visit, sometimes the third visit, and then all the way into survivorship, just to make sure that people are being supported in their needs. And while, one thing that you said early on was, treatment can destroy fertility. It doesn't always. In fact, there's a lot of data that suggests that in very young women, it probably won't. But it's something that if a woman was interested in having future biologic children or might have been, it's something that we've learned that sometimes people put it on the shelf and they don't want to think about it right away, but then it comes back as something for them that's important to think about later. Or if someone's, sometimes someone's in their early 20s and they're not even in that space in their head, but you have to help them to kind of think about it and also readdress it when they're ready with them. So it's kind of all along the way to address your question in a short and then a long way. And then the second part of your question is, do we think differently if someone has a hereditary predisposition to breast cancer? And the answer to that one is, yeah, we do a little bit, because there's a little bit more nuance that goes on. And as you heard from Susan, and we know that at least in the BRCA1 and 2 carriers, as well as in some of the other genetic predisposition syndromes, there's an increased risk of ovarian cancer. And so women will be counseled in order to reduce their ovarian cancer risk to have ovaries out. Now, fortunately, we're learning more about that, and Susan can speak to it more eloquently, but particularly with BRCA1, we worry about the ovaries a little bit earlier than with BRCA2. And so we generally will counsel women to try and have babies if they're going to sooner rather than later. And so that has implications also for whether they might want to preserve, because they won't have a whole lot of time later to wait for ovaries to wake up that much or to stimulate later, even if they might have naturally needed some IVF.
The other point, which I know that, and by the way, I wanted to emphasize Anne's point where we tell people to be worried about fertility, and then immediately after treatment, we start talking to them about what their birth control method is. And we realize that it's a little bit of whiplash. We've told them, you may not be able to get pregnant. And then they're like, okay, well, what are you going to use for, your contraception, because you could get pregnant? And they're like, didn't you tell me it was hard? So we realize that sometimes we seem inconsistent. For BRCA1 and 2, there's also this added issue of now it is possible to go through a process called pre-implantation genetic testing, where women go through, and their partners go through IVF, and then they screen the embryos and potentially only reimplant the embryos that don't have the BRCA1 or 2 mutation. As you can imagine, when you're talking to someone about this, when they are just diagnosed with cancer, I have to just emphasize Anne's point. We can make people's heads explode. So the idea that it's one conversation, we have to get past that. So we just have to kind of say, this is something that we should talk about and continue to consider. But, again, the earlier, the better.
Yeah. And that's obviously a delicate issue for many people, because, some people are right in on that, and some people find that, have an allergic reaction to that. One other piece I would add is that there's also some emerging data that suggests that in particular, BRCA1 mutation carriers may be a little less fertile or a little less able to stimulate to IVF compared to people who don't have a mutation or even BRCA2 mutation carriers. This is really new data. It hasn't changed the way we actually counsel people yet, but it's when they go and see the reproductive endocrinologist, if they're aware of this, that may have implications for, how they do it and when they do it.
Well, I think you both make a great point. This is a conversation that has to continue. I always think of the emoji with the head exploding as the exact emoji that you feel when you're getting delivered a cancer diagnosis. So it's, all these new terms, and you're seeking an opinion, and what's the difference between, first you see a breast surgeon and then an oncologist, and what's the order here, and what's the difference between chemotherapy and radiation? I mean, I hate to admit it, I consider myself a smart person, but I had no idea. And ER, PR positive, all this verbiage and lingo that is, what you guys speak in every day is something so new. So I found, some resources that helped me kind of figure out what these terms meant. I recorded a lot of my appointments because you only hear about a quarter of what people are saying. And the same goes with fertility. And if you're in a place, at the Chick Mission, we've helped, gals that are 22 years old and they have no idea. They just, they're so young. They have no idea about a partner or a family plan or anything like that. So I love that you guys are encouraging people to have numerous conversations. I think that's incredibly important. So Dr. Domchek, Susan, how do patients find out about genetic mutations? And then would you recommend that everyone get genetic testing?
Yeah, so the way that you have genetic testing these days is pretty straightforward. You can either have your blood drawn or even spit in a tube. In general, there are different ways to do it. You can do it through your healthcare provider, or there are increasingly direct-to-consumer options where you don't have to talk to anyone and you can just swipe your credit card and get a tube in the mail. I think what's really important is that you know what you're getting into. And I think that, if you will, this direct to consumer testing, the horse is out of the barn, the doors are closed, like it's never going, the genie's not going back in the bottle, whichever, analogy you want to use. So that's out there and available. But I do think that particularly for young women who haven't had a cancer diagnosis, understanding what the tests are before you send them is important. It's clear that all women with triple negative breast cancer, all women with ovarian cancer, all women with breast cancer under age 50, all men with metastatic prostate cancer, or anybody with pancreatic cancer, or metastatic prostate cancer, or anyone with pancreatic cancer, all those people should get tested. I think that, when you get down to sort of a 70-year-old with no family history with ER positive disease, that is a low risk situation. There is a lot of discussion, out there about, do you test every person with breast cancer or not? I just focus on the fact that we currently don't test that first group that I talked to you about. It is shocking how many people don't get genetic testing. And I think Erica will speak to this, and that is fewer people in minority populations get genetic testing. And we just have to fix those problems. Now, whether everybody, who hasn't had a cancer diagnosis should get genetic testing, those are, I would say that I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we're doing sort of in 5 or 10 years, but we've got a lot of things to sort out. For instance, why only test for BRCA1 and 2? There's other genetic conditions that are equally problematic. There's things that stop your heart beating, like probably that soccer player has. There's all sorts of other genetic conditions. And so we have to sort this out, because sometimes we find a gene mutation and it actually isn't important. And we need to make sure that we understand what is important and what is not. So that was sort of a long-winded answer to your question, but I am intent on making sure that the people who really qualify for genetic testing get it. The one other thing I'll say is individuals who are Ashkenazi Jewish descent, 1 in 40 have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation. That's very high. Having said that, BRCA1 and 2 mutations are seen in every race, every ethnicity. So family history matters, all these other things matter. But again, it wouldn't surprise me if in a number of years, it's a routine test, but primary care doctors right now, some are kind of, ready for this, but a lot aren't. So we need to do a lot of education in the primary care doctor community. We need to focus on the size of the gene panels. So as you mentioned, these gene panels are now huge. I can tell you that there are genes on those panels that we have shown have no increased risk of cancer, and yet they remain on those panels. So we have work to do before we sort of just blow it all open. That's, but again, this is a little controversial, and I tend to potentially be a little bit more conservative than others.
Understood. Well, it's a good place to actually shift to Erica, having a family history of breast cancer. As a young woman, how did you approach making these important decisions? First to undergo genetic testing and later to have a preventative treatment.
Yeah, so I think my experience or decision rather to undergo genetic testing is very much informed by seeing my mom go through breast cancer diagnosis, not once, but twice. So the first time my mom had breast cancer was in 1993, and this was a couple of years before researchers had found BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. She was only 28 at the time. So she had a lumpectomy, she did chemo, she did radiation, and then she was in remission for about 14 years. And then my mom had a second cancer diagnosis. My senior year of college, she had triple negative breast cancer in a different location, different breast. And that's when she underwent genetic testing and learned that she had a BRCA2 mutation. And because she decided to get treatment at UNC, where I was finishing my senior year, I went to a lot of those appointments with her. So I had known since I was 21 that I had a 50% chance of carrying the mutation as well. I think with respect to the decision to actually get tested, I think some of it was very time to age. I knew my mom had breast cancer when she was 28. So when I was turning 28, I was like, it was like a light bulb of, hey, I should probably figure out like what is going on with this whole genetic testing situation. And I think some of it was feeling like I was in a place in my life where I was ready to receive that kind of information. I was in what I thought was a pretty serious long-term relationship, and I was in a pretty good place in terms of my career and finances. I also understand I have a lot of privilege coming into the situation because I live in New York City, where it's very, very easy to access a genetic counselor. So I initially made a decision to have my testing done at Memorial Sloan Kettering. But because there is a shortage of genetic counselors in the United States, there was a 6-month wait list. So I was fortunate to then be connected with the high-risk surveillance program at NYU and had my genetic testing done in June of 2014. And because of my family history, I didn't really have a long amount of time between like learning that I was BRCA positive for a mutation and the decision to have a preventative surgery, because I got the results back in July 2014. And the conversation that I had with my oncologist was pretty much like, given your family history and like a review of your mom's medical records, I would recommend that you have a preventative mastectomy as soon as possible. So, when I look back on it, I think that decision was informed by a couple of things, right? I think the first is, I think my mom has PTSD in some ways from having breast cancer after being in remission that long, because she thought breast cancer was sort of like a chapter that she had closed, right? We didn't know that she had this mutation. And so in my mind, I was like, okay, well, I can either, undergo surveillance every 6 months and always sort of be living, right, with the threat of breast cancer hanging over my head, or I can like have surgery on my own terms when I can schedule it when I want, when I'm healthy, and I can like build a very supportive, network around myself. And also knowing that I had a mutation, I was like, well, if I'm ever diagnosed with breast cancer, we're going to end up in the same place of having a mastectomy, right? So it's kind of like, do I want to do it now or do I just want to do it later?
Yeah, no, it's not an easy decision to make, obviously, but having that knowledge, I can't remember if it was Susan or Ann, but knowledge is power. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think, I commend you, Erica. Not an easy thing to decide. but happy that you did it. So like we touched upon earlier, these processes and conversations are complicated, and they can vary widely from person to person. So, Anne, what do you tell young women who are looking for fertility advice? Whether or not to freeze eggs or embryos, how do you guide them through the toll that these decisions can take on their mental and emotional health?
So we're fortunate to be in an era where it's really important to know upfront when you're dealing with someone as soon as possible what the possible treatments might be. And nowadays, we don't give everyone chemotherapy. It used to be a young woman would walk in the door and there's, almost 100% chance she would get chemotherapy. Now, of course, breast cancer is not one disease. Young women can and do get wimpy breast cancer, is what I like to call it, that isn't going to benefit much from chemotherapy. So we have increasing data to suggest that some breast cancers don't get a lot of benefit from that. And therefore, a young woman getting only hormonal therapy along with the local therapy, the treatments wouldn't necessarily directly impact on her fertility. The time it takes to get the treatment would impact on her fertility. And so if she's going to turn 38 during that time and wants to preserve eggs or embryos, as you get older, fertility goes down, then you might do that even with endocrine therapy alone. But a young woman who needs only endocrine therapy, you might not do anything except say, okay, once you get off after a 5-year course, if it's a low risk breast cancer, get off, get pregnant, do, complete your family planning or have one baby and then get back on for a little while till you're done with a second if you wanted to do longer that. Unfortunately, most young women do end up needing chemotherapy, and then the likelihood of needing anything to preserve eggs or embryos really has to do with a young woman's age. So the younger one is, the less likely it is that chemotherapy will impact on her fertility. And there's some nuances with regard to treatments, as well as the treatment she's receiving. And then as well as whether or not she wants to go through the rigmarole of fertility preservation. Preserving your eggs and your embryos entails going to a reproductive endocrinologist, going through stimulation of your eggs in your body, IVF type stimulation, and then a procedure, which is a day procedure, to extract the eggs and then either partner them with sperm in a test tube or freeze the eggs. And you can do both of those these days. And if a single person comes along, they might also want to freeze embryos. So then they have to find eggs. They have to find sperm, and that means going to the sperm bank. You can see how complicated this can get. The nice thing is that as of a few years ago, freezing eggs has gotten as good as freezing embryos. So it's become easier for single people who don't want to go to the sperm bank and to freeze and preserve their fertility. And then finally, there's another option that people can do, which is not as good and controversial, but sometimes women will take suppression of their ovary medication, a GnRH analog, to protect their ovaries through chemotherapy. It's controversial because it does appear to prevent premature menopause, but it's maybe modestly preventative of premature infertility. It's not quite as robust. And so sometimes people do both, and sometimes people do one or the other. But, I talk to each woman about it. We talk about what her passion is about having a future biologic child, along with her partner, if she has a partner. Sometimes the parents are involved, especially when you're dealing with very young people. And it's a really personal decision at a very stressful time. So the other thing I always do is bring in psychosocial support, our social workers, family members. Often women come and they have a therapist. You want to make sure that they are supported as they're thinking about these things. And these are long conversations and often require more than one. So you kind of have to step out and take the time to really help a woman vet what she wants to do in the here and now and what can wait.
Yeah, no, it's complicated and it's case by case. And I can speak to my own personal journey. I was actually married at the time of my first diagnosis, but struggling in my marriage and didn't know what to do. And so I did freeze eggs. There's there's the added complication of once it becomes an embryo, it's two people who are making a decision about it. So I'm very, at the Chick Mission, we provide grants up to the amount of egg freezing. And that is actually by design, because 3 of us on our board have gone through divorce after cancer. And so we let anybody can make their own decision about what they do, but we feel like it's almost our duty to protect people who are making decisions so quickly. And that also might be super controversial, but I'm glad that I did it. I think we almost have to take a step back and look at ourselves and our bodies and know that we're born with every single egg we'll ever have. And know that, maybe you're struggling with a cancer diagnosis and treatment, or maybe you've been suffering from endometriosis and you didn't know about it, or all these things that can impact your future ability to have biological children. So I do personally recommend that people at least go see a reproductive endocrinologist when they get diagnosed to understand kind of what their baseline is. What do all the tests say? And then you can make an informed decision about, what path you should take. And it's only in the last few years that there's been some legislative change mandating coverage here. This is expensive. And, we exist, hopefully not for that much longer, because we want all 50 states to pass legislation as it relates to this. Nobody elects to have cancer. So I do think, thinking about your age at diagnosis, getting a quick workup with a reproductive endocrinologist, and then depending upon your treatment, whether it's chemotherapy or long-term drug therapy, that might close your window. We all know we have that cliff that everyone talks about, your biological clock at 35. So not to steal the panel, but that's my 2 cents.
I think, as I just want to say, it's so important. And the psychosocial toll, Anne's mentioned it, Amanda, you've mentioned it. The other psychosocial toll that we have to prepare people for is that you can go through this process and you can end up with not much. You can have gone through this whole process and not have eggs or not have embryos. And people who do the pre-implantation genetic testing for the selection of BRCA1 and 2, that adds even more, because half the embryos will have the gene mutation. So we do try to spend a lot of time preparing people. I mean, it can be a crushing disappointment in the midst of all this. And so, this psychosocial support and knowing that there are a lot of people out there that are dealing with the same things is so important, because, it's not infertility, but it's some of the same issues. And it can be sort of this silent, it shouldn't be silent and it shouldn't feel like shame, but so many of those emotions can come into play with all this. So, so I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah. I just want to add, and it happening at the same time, right? I mean, breast cancer is hard, infertility is hard, or the idea of infertility. And the other thing I will add is, one thing I speak to physicians about a lot is patients will often come to me and they'll tell me that the doctor said, well, you already have one. And as a second child, I resent that. But I think, we've studied this, and Susan made fun of me when one of our results was, yes, a person who doesn't have a baby is going to be a little more likely to want a baby at diagnosis. But guess what? Plenty of people that already have one want a second. Yes. And that's not greedy.
I didn't
that's
make
not
fun
crazy.
of you.
You made fun of me years ago.
But
plenty of people want a second child, and that's a normal human thing to want. It's, we are, you don't have to want a child. That's okay too. But it's fascinating, the psyche and the things that sometimes well-intended doctors who are just focused on treating the cancer say. And I always try to say, you don't understand. That person wanted, you're taking something important away from them, or the cancer is, you got to help them around that or help them to over that.
Right. Even better is well, you can just adopt comment, which, I'll tell you, I have one biologic child and one adopted child. So I'm a fan of adoption, but no one should throw that out as an equivalent experience. That's not. And so we try to educate our providers too, because sometimes doctors say stupid things as much as we love them.
As much as we love them. Yes. And I agree. I mean, I'm a 3-time cancer survivor. There's a lot of hurdles to adopt. And I did go through 3 rounds of fertility preservation at 37, 39, and 39. I got 3 eggs, 0 eggs and 3 eggs. And I agree, crushing, but I am so thankful that I had my rainy day fund to now have 6 eggs that I can choose to do something with. So yes, but shifting gears, because I want to talk about positive things, like Erica being recently engaged and planning a wedding amid, a global pandemic, which obviously comes with its own set of complications. But I wanted to, kind of talk to you about how you approach this topic with your future husband.
Yeah, I would just say before I was dating my current partner, I did look into egg freezing. This was in 2016. And personally, I think because for many of the reasons that were raised by Susan and Ann, right, in terms of the expense, the time, the invasiveness of the procedure, the fact that there was only going to be like, I think a 10% chance of success, right? And then to also potentially have to like lose eggs if I was going to do PGD. And I have very strong feelings about PGD personally. And by the way, I know people who've done PGD. PGD is awesome for them. Just kind of this idea of like, I have a BRCA mutation, right? So like, what if someone had looked at me and decided not to have me? But anyway, so for all those reasons, although I met with someone who's very wonderful at Cornell Weill, egg freezing did not feel right for me, because I think I was also just like, I've had a lot of medical interventions, like maybe let's just not medically intervene in this situation. In terms of how I approach this topic with my partner, well, as of like this weekend, having spent time with my college roommate, who was a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 2-month-old, I'm pretty sure that I called him this weekend and I was like, yeah, I don't really think having kids is a good idea. This feels very like draining and time. This feels like hard. But all jokes aside, I mean, I think since we've first started our relationship, I'm very like open and honest in talking about, like when I have like my CA-125 and when I go to get transvaginal ultrasounds, and my fiance is not someone who is like sort of well-versed in science or medicine. He is a poet, right? So also like trying to have these conversations in a way that feels accessible to him. Although he always tells people now that because we've been together during the pandemic, he is an expert on BRCA mutations and racial disparities. But we also like, I have a therapist. My therapist has been very instrumental in helping me to think about both how to have these conversations with another person, and then also helping me to reconcile like the feelings I have around like motherhood and just actually, being someone who carries a mutation. And we are planning to do premarital counseling. And one of the topics, that or at least I have on my list, right? Sort of this idea of like, do we ultimately like want kids or not? And then also kind of just like what the long-term implications of my mutation are, right? Like, I will have to have my ovaries taken out at some point. Like I still have to do screening for the ovarian cancer risk. I'll start colonoscopies. I'm 36, so I think I start those in a couple of years, right? And we find out more and more about connections between BRCA mutations and cancer risk all the time. So that was a really long-winded way of saying that it's kind of just something that we are in constant dialogue about.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject, it's important to remember it's not all about women. There are men who also have the BRCA gene and can carry that mutation. So, Susan, what can you tell us about, how BRCA impacts men?
It's such an important point. If you line up all the BRCA 1 and 2 mutation carriers in the world, 50% are men. People don't tend to think about it that way. And if you have a BRCA 1 or 2 mutation, it's a 50-50 chance it came from your mom or your dad. I can tell you that women and men and healthcare providers don't think of it this way. And a lot of people get asked, about, did your mom have cancer? They don't ask, like, is there cancer in your family? So even the way that we take family histories are very biased against this. But it does matter to men. It matters in a number of ways. The first is that each of their children will have a 50-50 chance of inheriting the gene mutation. But particularly for BRCA2, there are discrete risks to men. For BRCA2 mutations, men are at increased risk of developing bad prostate cancer. The lifetime risk is over 25%. a risk of male breast cancer, which is about 7%, which might not sound like much, except that the risk in the general population is 0.1%. So it gives you a sense of how elevated that risk is. There is a risk of pancreatic cancer as well, and melanoma. So the risks for men who have BRCA1 mutations are somewhat less, although there are, again, increased risk for pancreatic cancer. And these decisions, so these reproductive decisions, just to get back to for a moment, I can't tell you the number of times that I've had a husband and wife in front of me, and the husband is absolutely opposed to PGT for the exact reason, Erica, that you said, which is like, you're my wife, I love you, you have this mutation, right? So it's really complicated, and it's a relationship between two people making this decision, right? It's not just one. And so I usually say to people, some people think it's great, some people think it's awful. I'm the messenger. This technology is available, and I'm happy to talk to you about it because so many things come into play. The relationship between a couple, what's happened in the family, all of those things. And then when you get down to the nitty gritty of how likely it is to work. So so for all these reasons, we know that men don't get tested nearly as much as women do. There is mass under testing. What has helped with that a little bit, but again, it's kind of too late at this point, is that because metastatic prostate cancer patients, they all should have testing now. And because all pancreatic cancer patients should have testing and all male breast cancer patients should have testing, we are getting more men in, but again, they've already had cancer. So the idea behind genetic testing is to try to prevent cancer or catch it really early. And so we have work to do.
Indeed. So as we start to wrap up a little bit, we want to kind of touch upon a few topics that I know are especially important to our panelists and to the TPA community. Erica, in your storytelling and advocacy work, you really give a voice to the BRCA positive experience from the perspective of a Black woman. So I'm curious, if you could tell us a little bit more about why this is so important.
Yeah, I could probably talk about that for like 2 panels, but I'll try to be really brief. So I think at the heart of it is that, like, I think we've been talking about like the psychosocial aspect of this. And I always tell people I am a professional internet user. I'm on the internet a lot. So when things happen to me, like I turn to the internet or to like, I like to read things to help me figure them out. And so when I was first diagnosed as carrying a mutation, I went online because I was like, oh, there must be stories from other people like myself who have gone through this experience. And I just didn't find any, which is actually why I started like doing a lot of the writing and advocacy work that we have kind of been talking about. But in terms of why it's important, I think it's important beyond myself because we know that there are disparities in who accesses genetic counseling and testing. I believe, at least the most current research I've seen, is that Black women are 16 times less likely to have genetic counseling and testing, even when they meet criteria, and that has ripple effects. We know that Black women are much more likely to die from breast cancer in the United States. We know that they are diagnosed at younger ages. We know that they're diagnosed with more aggressive forms of cancer, and when they don't get access to this information, genetics really has, it kind of scares me because I think the utilization of cancer genomics actually has a chance of increasing the disparities that we see, because if one set of patients is getting access to this very personalized information and one is not, that's a problem. If one set is doing PGD and one is not, you're just going to see those disparities increase. But also for someone to go through something that is this personal and emotional, they have to think that it is relevant to them. That's kind of like what I call the flywheel of doing genetic counseling and testing. You have to think that the procedure is relevant to you. And if you never see stories with people who look like you talking about it, you probably don't think it's as relevant to you. And also providers, right? Like, most people have these conversations with a PCP or an OBGYN. And if they don't ever hear about Black women or Latinx women who carry mutation, they might not see that patient when they come to the office and think to themselves like, oh, let me do the family history. Let me like engage in a conversation about cancer genetics. So I am only one person, and I often think of this as like, you kind of have to engage like providers and genetic counselors and researchers. But it's just really important to discuss so that I can at least get people talking about it and thinking about it.
Yeah, it's incredibly important to level the playing field as far as access to education, access to testing, access to options. And, I think one of the things that we've been trying to do as an organization is really to engage, the next generation of doctors and the med students, et cetera, to understand, what's happening with maternal mortality and, access and genetic testing, et cetera. And I really commend you for being, out there and talking about it and starting, advocacy groups. It's really important. So switching gears just slightly, and there have been some studies that investigate a potential link between fertility treatments and increased breast cancer. So what do you say to an average young woman who has concerns about this?
Yeah, so the studies that have linked fertility treatments like IVF to increased risk of breast cancer have essentially been debunked. The methodology, when they did it correctly, as in compared people who went to an IVF clinic and got IVF to people who went to an IVF clinic and didn't get IVF, because that's the purest, right? If you're comparing people who go to an IVF clinic, AKA are infertile, to people who are out in the general public, you're comparing apples and oranges in terms of the breast cancer risk. And some of the same things that increase the risk of being infertile or associated with the risk of being infertile are also associated with the risk of developing breast cancer. So when they did the studies more properly, the IVF drugs themselves have not been associated with an increased risk of developing breast cancer. That being said, there are some drugs that are associated with increased risk of developing breast cancer, and some epidemiologic and environmental things, mostly internal things, not external environment, that it's been shown. And one of the things that has a very small increased risk of developing breast cancer is birth control, oral contraceptives. The newer, lower dose pills don't increase it very much, but they do increase it on a population basis. And yet, even with a slightly increased risk, you have to weigh that kind of thing against the prevention of an unwanted pregnancy in a generally low risk person. And then Susan can speak to this better than I, but we also use oral contraception in our BRCA1 and 2 carriers to prevent ovarian cancer. So even in a group that's very high risk and being potentially screened before they get pregnant, and before they might have, risk reducing surgeries or have their ovaries removed, we actually use the birth control. Susan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's a great point. We are essentially, that's exactly right. We tell people that there are good things about birth control pills and there are bad things about birth control pills. And good things are, you don't get pregnant, it controls your cycles, it clears up your acne, it helps your mood. There's all sorts of reasons people take it. It also lowers your ovarian cancer risk. And on the other side, birth control pills increase the risk of blood clots. And then there's this very small increased risk of breast cancer, which does not appear magnified by the presence of a genetic mutation. And again, when people are taking them, their risk of breast cancer is usually super tiny. And the risk of breast cancer actually does go down when you're off the pill. It takes a couple of years, but it does go down. And so for that reason, it's really an individual decision, but we get asked all the time, should my 15-year-old get genetic testing to decide on birth control? And the answer is no. So that's a hard no, like that, because we don't view it as a contraindication to take birth control pills. We're constantly doing research and we're happy to refine those, that discussion the more we know, but that's where we stand right now.
Yeah,
and we also let everybody get IVF. The other thing is anybody who needs IVF, there's no hard nose there with regard to the, it's not a spectator sport. There are risks to the procedure and, complications that can happen. Pregnancy itself, and certainly bringing up children is, as you alluded to, Erica, not always fun, but.
Well, I would say, Susan, similar to the Pink Agenda and the Chick Mission, you engaged young professionals, including Erica and Ellie, to help advance the Vassar Center's mission. So I'm wondering, why is it important to you to include younger people in the center's work, and how has their involvement benefited the organization?
Absolutely. If you ask any researcher worth their salt, they can tell you that their best ideas usually come from their advocates. And I mean that sincerely. You know, sometimes we can sort of be on a path of what we decide is important, and then someone says, they ask an obvious question, and we're like, yeah, why is that? Or what are we going to do about that? And so it has been extremely important to us. And I'm going to give you a very specific example with Erica and Ellie, is that we actually know that there are these disparities. And we look around and you notice Ann and I are both white. Well, when you go to genetic counselors, there are almost no genetic counselors in the country that are not white. And most are women too. There's just, and part of that disparity is because genetic counseling school actually kind of costs a lot of money. And unlike being a physician where eventually you make it up, genetic counselors don't make that much money. So it's not, you know, it's very difficult to go into if you don't have that access. And so we've started a program this summer. And again, this is in large part because of suggestions given to us by our Young Leadership Council. We have an underrepresented minority program for undergrads this summer where we have 5 students who are just rotating through the various types of work that you can do within genetics, basic research, genetic counseling, physicians. And we've also been fortunate to fundraise for a scholarship program at Penn for the genetic counseling schools that will be able to fund underrepresented minority genetic counselors master's level positions. So that's just a small example. But again, that wasn't a primary focus of our work when we started, but it became so. So we have a Latinx initiative, we have a Black and BRCA initiative, and we're trying to not just increase awareness, education, put stories on our website for people so that they see people who look like them, but also increase providers that look like underrepresented minorities too. I mean, because that's really how you do things. So we can't do it without your hearing your concerns and knowing what's the most important thing. And I know that Ann will second this because she works with advocates all the time.
Yeah, and both of you have, research that you do and that the initiatives that you guys are pursuing and continue to pursue is, really it's made available through the Pink Agenda, and the funding that they receive. So, I'm not shy. I raise money for a living. So, I will remind everyone that's tuning in to continue to to text TPA Talks to the number 44321. Super easy to remember. But I really just wanted to say thank you, to both Susan and Ann as researchers and physicians, to Erica as a strong advocate, previvor who's taking control of her life and her future. Thank you all for such a thoughtful and informative discussion. These conversations can be really challenging. And I think we're all on a similar page about knowledge is power, but there are different ways and different approaches, and you have to do what's right for you as a patient. But the fact that both Susan and Ann spend so much time with their patients, just going through these complicated scenarios over and over is something that, all patients benefit from. So I just want to, thank you guys for joining us. Thank the panelists for being so open and honest. And, TPA Talks, this is genetics and fertility, and we're hoping you'll return for the next installment, which is actually about disparities in breast cancer. And that's going to take place on Wednesday, November 11th. And please refer to your digital program booklet for more information about other TPA events that are coming up and initiatives. And again, I will be the commercial because I have no fear. No, really, if you could, any amount of money is helpful. It's all going to add up and give us more hours of research. So if you could continue to text TPA Talks, ask your friends and family to. Text that to 44321. And, this work is life-changing for everybody affected with breast cancer. And, you're going to truly improve outcomes for all young women who are facing this devastating disease. So thank you so much and have a great night.
Thank you, Amanda. It's such a pleasure. Take
Thank
care.
you so much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.